This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So, if you've ever opened a standard philosophy textbook, you get this picture, right? Ancient Greece, then maybe a gap, then boom, modern thinkers like Kant.
Right. A nice, clean line.
Exactly. But the sources we've looked at suggest that story is, well, heavily edited. Our mission today is to kind of peel back those edits.
Yeah, to look at where ideas got shuffled around, maybe ignored, or even just completely absorbed into something else.
We want to find the moments where the narrative we inherited was intentionally shaped, because it seems less like a straightforward history and more like a product of later agendas, theological, political.
What some historians call a dramatic editorial history.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the real tensions underneath.
Yeah.
Reason versus faith, East versus West. Who gets to be the authority, really?
Okay, let's unpack this.
And that linear structure, it's great for teaching, makes it easy to grasp. But accurate history, not so much. It smooths over all the interesting bumps.
Okay, let's start with a big one. That classic classroom setup, British empiricism. Locke, Hume, all about experience versus continental rationalism, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, all about pure reason.
Yes, the famous split.
It feels so neat, geographically divided, thematically opposed. But does it actually hold up historically based on what we're seeing?
Well, no, not really. The sources are pretty clear that this binary, this neat split, it's largely a construction after Kant.
After Kant, why?
It seems it was incredibly useful for framing Kant's own critical philosophy. He positioned himself as the one who could synthesize these two supposedly opposing camps.
So simplifying the history beforehand made his achievement look even bigger.
Right. Create the problem, then solve it.
Kind of, yeah. And if you look closer at the so-called rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, were they really a unified team?
Probably not.
Definitely not. Descartes was, after certainty, using doubt. Spinoza.
Sir?
He was using reason, like geometrical proofs, to map out this divine order, this pantheistic idea where God is the universe.
And Leibniz was building this incredibly complex system of monads, these sort of fundamental units of reality, aiming for a kind of pre-established harmony. They all used reason, sure, but for wildly different goals.
So the label rationalist kind of papers over those massive differences.
Yeah, absolutely does. And then there's the empiricism side. Was it only happening in Britain? And were reason and experience really enemies? Think about Newton or Galileo.
Yeah, they use both observation and mathematics theory.
Exactly. They integrated empirical data with rational deduction all the time. The geographical split just doesn't map onto the reality of how people were working. It ignores important figures, these cross-currents like Gassendi or Boyle. It's just too neat, a convenient story, not the full picture.
Okay, so the moderns got rearranged for Kant's convenience. Let's rewind way back. How were the ancient Greeks, like Plato and Aristotle, handled? We often hear their ideas, Plato's good, Aristotle's unmoved mover, presented as sort of early drafts of the monotheistic God.
This is maybe the most significant distortion. It really shifted the foundations. Let's take Plato's idea of the good. It's an arche, right? A first principle.
A principle, okay.
Crucially, it's not a person. It's the condition that makes everything else exist and be knowable. Think of it like the sun. It doesn't make the things you see, but it provides the light so you can see them.
So it enables, but doesn't create. No will, no personality.
Exactly. It's a source of ultimate order and reality, but not a conscious creator figure. It's like a light source, not really a cause in the way we usually mean it.
Okay. And Aristotle's unmoved mover, that wasn't a creator god starting the universe either.
Not according to Aristotle himself. He thought the universe was eternal, always existed. The unmoved mover, well, it moves things by being loved. It's the ultimate goal or purpose, the final cause, drawing everything towards itself as the pinnacle of order.
So it's a principle of attraction almost, a logical necessity for order in an eternal cosmos.
Precisely. It's a conclusion based on observing motion and purpose, not an agent who kicked things off.
That difference principle of order versus a willful creator is huge.
Massive. The later monotheistic God, whether Christian or Islamic, is fundamentally a personal being with intention, will, love, who creates the world, gives it a beginning.
So how did Plato's good and Aristotle's mover get, conflated with this creator God?
It was a deliberate theological reinterpretation over centuries.
Yeah.
Thinkers in the Neoplatonic tradition like Plotinus, and then later, very importantly, figures in scholasticism like Augustine and Aquinas. They needed philosophical backup.
They wanted the Greek giants on their side.
Essentially, yes.
Mhm.
They mapped their concept of God onto these Greek principles to give their theology philosophical weight, to claim that Greek philosophy was really just pointing towards the eventual revelation of their God all along.
Okay, we've got rearranging the moderns, reinterpreting the ancients. What about just leaving things out entirely? That standard story often jumps from ancient Greece, skips over 1,000 years, often labeled the Dark Ages, and lands in the Renaissance. That whole gap, it wasn't actually empty, was it?
Oh, absolutely not. That Dark Ages idea, especially for philosophy and science, is largely an Enlightenment era myth. It served a particular narrative, a Eurocentric one.
So where was the action then?
The intellectual energy, the preservation, and importantly, the development of Greek thought, particularly Aristotle, was happening in the Islamic world. Think of the Abbasid Caliphate, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
Right, I've heard of that.
It was huge. Philosophers writing in Arabic, the Falsafa tradition, people like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, who's Ibn Sina, and Averroes Ibn Rushd, they didn't just save Aristotle. They translated him, wrote extensive commentaries, debated him, integrated his ideas with their own philosophical and theological systems. Without them, the West wouldn't have gotten Aristotle back. Certainly not in the developed form they did.
Wow. So effectively, Islamic philosophy was the bridge, the crucial link. Why isn't that front and center in the standard history? Why the erasure?
Well, politics and theology again. After the Crusades, and especially as the Church in the West consolidated its power and then faced the Reformation, there was a growing suspicion, even fear, of Islamic rationalism.
Fear. Why?
Because Islamic thinkers had grappled so intensely with how to reconcile reason and faith, often giving reason a very powerful role. Take Avicenna, his ideas about existence and essence, or the concept of God as the necessary existent. These were incredibly influential.
And Thomas Aquinas used those ideas, didn't he? Heavily.
Absolutely central to Aquinas' proofs for God in his metaphysics. But if you look at how Aquinas is often presented, or how his work was used later, the Islamic source gets downplayed, obscured, sometimes almost erased.
To avoid controversy.
Partly that. There were official condemnations, like in Paris in 1277, targeting certain Aristotelian ideas, some associated with Verrose. So, citing Islamic sources directly could be dangerous, seen as potentially heretical. It became safer, politically and theologically, for Latin scholars to construct a narrative that went straight from Greece to Rome, maybe Augustine, and then jump to the scholastics like Aquinas, basically editing out that vital Islamic intermediary stage.
So the story became Greece, Latin Europe, modernity. Wow, that changes how you read someone like Aquinas completely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift back towards the modern era again. Another interesting angle from the sources is looking at the period from Aquinas up to Hegel. Instead of just a sequence of thinkers, it's framed as this dramatic power struggle, a kind of master-servant reversal between faith and reason.
Yes, that's a really insightful way to frame it. It's like a single long drama playing out over centuries.
So where does it start? Aquinas.
Aquinas is the starting point, where reason is explicitly the ancilla fidei, the handmaiden of theology. Faith is the absolute master, the source of truth. Reason is just a tool, useful for clarifying or defending what faith already holds.
Okay, reason is the servant who takes the first step towards, well, liberation.
You could argue it's Descartes, the separator. Remember his I think, therefore I am. He establishes the certainty of the thinking self first, on reason's own ground, before he even gets to proving God.
Ah, so reason built its own foundation, separate from faith's house.
Exactly. It carves out its own autonomous space. It doesn't need faith's permission to exist or be certain of itself.
Then Kant comes along. He famously put limits on reason, saying we can't know things like God or the soul through pure reason alone. Wasn't that a step back for reason's power?
You might think so, but it can also be seen as a declaration of independence within defined borders.
Yeah.
Kant is basically saying reason is the ultimate judge of everything within the realm of possible experience. It's its own limits. So it acknowledges there are things beyond its reach, the noumenal world, but within its territory, the phenomenal world, it reigns supreme. Reason and faith become, maybe, neighbors living in separate houses, acknowledging each other's territory but not subservient. Kant establishes the boundary.
Okay, the independent neighbor, and then Hegel.
Hegel is the final act, the overthrow. For Hegel, reason or absolute spirit as it unfolds through history doesn't just live next door to religion, it ultimately absorbs it.
Absorbs it. How?
Religion, for Hegel, becomes understood as an earlier sort of symbolic or pictorial stage of the same truth that philosophy grasps conceptually, rationally. Reason essentially reconstructs theology within its own system, claiming to understand religion better than religion understood itself.
Wow. So the handmaiden ends up becoming the master of the entire estate.
Precisely. The hierarchy set up by Aquinas is completely inverted. Reason claims ultimate authority.
This is fascinating, looking at how the story gets shaped. Let's jump right back to the very beginning. The guy, usually called the father of philosophy, Thales, the water guy, is he really the starting point for philosophy?
Well, the sources suggest it's more accurate to call Thales the father of, say, natural science or maybe proto-scientific thinking, asking, what is the world made of?
Okay, focused on nature, the physical stuff.
Right. The idea of him being the philosophical ancestor number one,
Yeah.
that seems to be largely an invention, or at least a framing, by Aristotle.
Aristotle again, why did you do that?
Aristotle had his own system, his theory of the four causes: material, formal, efficient, final. He needed a history, an origin story for his own project. So he looked back and saw Thales talking about water as the fundamental stuff.
The material cause.
Bingo. Aristotle essentially framed Thales as the first guy to ask about the material cause, making him the perfect starting point for a history that, naturally, culminates in Aristotle's own more complete system.
So a bit self-serving, historically speaking.
You could say that. But then, almost immediately after Thales and those early natural philosophers, you get Socrates. And Socrates marks a huge shift, doesn't he?
Right, he wasn't asking what the world is made of, he was asking how we should live, ethics, virtue.
Exactly. Socrates explicitly turned away from that kind of natural speculation. He said the real focus should be the human soul, ethics, self-knowledge, not the cosmos. That's a profound redirection of what philosophy is even about.
And that Socratic turn focusing inward, that carried on.
Very much so, especially through Plato. And then later, Augustine really cements this. He heavily leans on Plato and argues that true philosophy is about the soul's ascent towards God's light. For Augustine, trying to figure out the world's origin purely through nature, like Thales did, without reference to God's creation, that was almost arrogant.
So the definition of philosophy itself was contested right from the start. Thales' project wasn't necessarily seen as the main event by those who came later.
Precisely. The Thales his father narrative is one particular lineage, promoted by Aristotle, but not the only way the story could have been told.
This brings us back to power and politics shaping the narrative. The sources challenge two big stories we often hear. First, that whole science versus religion conflict. If people like Newton were deeply religious, what was the conflict really about?
Yeah, the warfare model is often oversimplified. What the sources point to is that the conflict was often more political and territorial than purely intellectual.
By territorial.
In the sense of intellectual territory and authority. Think about the Catholic Church, especially before the Reformation. It had heavily invested in a specific worldview, largely based on Aristotle as interpreted by Aquinas. This wasn't just theology. It was tied to social order and the Church's own centralized authority.
So challenging that scientific worldview, like Galileo did,
Was seen as challenging the Church's authority to define truth and potentially undermining the social and political order it represented. So Galileo wasn't crushed simply by religion in the abstract, but by the political machinery defending Catholic institutional power.
Interesting. And what about Protestant areas?
Well, in many Protestant lands like England, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, there was often less conflict or a different dynamic. Empirical science, studying nature's laws, was sometimes seen as a way to understand and praise God's rational creation. Think of Newton seeing mathematical laws as God's language.
So the context, the political structure mattered hugely.
Immensely. It wasn't a simple science versus religion battle everywhere. It was often about who controlled knowledge and interpretation within specific political contexts.
Okay, second narrative challenge, German idealism. We often think of Kant and Hegel as the dominant force, the absolute peak of philosophy in their time. Was that really the case internationally?
Well, they were obviously hugely influential, especially within German universities and intellectual life. But the idea that German idealism was the undisputed international mainstream in, say, the 19th century, that's debatable.
What else was big then?
You had really powerful movements elsewhere. In France, you had positivism with Comte. In Britain, you had ongoing empiricism and the rise of utilitarianism, Bentham, Mill. These were often much more focused on social issues, science, practical application.
So maybe less metaphysically ambitious than Hegel?
Perhaps, yeah. The point is, the narrative that positions German idealism, particularly Kant and Hegel, as the single central trunk of the philosophical tree, with everything else as minor branches, that narrative itself seems to have been constructed later.
Constructed. By whom? For what reason?
Largely by academics, particularly the neo-Kantians in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in Germany. After German unification, there was a strong cultural push to define a unique German intellectual heritage. Promoting Kant and Hegel as the culmination of philosophy served as a powerful nationalistic narrative. It positioned Germany as the leader of modern thought.
So again, academic and political forces shaping the history we read.
It seems that way. It doesn't mean Kant and Hegel aren't important. Obviously they are. But their position as the sole dominant mainstream might be more of a curated story than the messy reality of the time. #outro.
So what does this all mean? We've kind of gone through the looking glass today, the history of Western philosophy. It seems less like a calm river flowing smoothly and more like a series of, well, contested terrains and edited maps.
Definitely. You have these foundational figures, Plato and Aristotle, offering these two huge prototypes, the transcendent world of forms, the immanent reality we experience, and then centuries of debate, heavily mediated by theology, by Islamic philosophers, by political needs.
Leading up to the modern era where reason first declared independence and then, with Hegel, maybe tried to take over everything.
It forces you to see the history not just as a sequence of ideas, but as a story about who gets to tell the story, who gets cited, who gets ignored, and why. The narrative itself is a construction, often serving the interests of the narrator, whether that's a school of thought, a church, or a nation.
Okay, so we've given you two versions of the history now. There's the standard textbook one, neat, linear, often simplified. And then there's this unpacked version, messier, more political, full of edits and omissions. The revised map is definitely richer, maybe more challenging.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. And that leads to our final question for you, the listener. Thinking about this process of narrative construction, what other historical story that you currently accept, maybe it's about the history of your country or art or economics, what widely accepted narrative might also be a carefully constructed myth designed perhaps to uphold the authority of whoever's telling it, something to chew on?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.